Let's see. Did everyone receive the hard copy of the PowerPoint that Elise sent out?
I did.
So I'm not sure if it'll be easier to work with a shared screen or to keep that side by side on your computer.
Because we're recording, I probably will put it up on the screen.
Okay.
In the hopes that that'll come through in the recording.
Okay. Well, Monica, you seem to be muted, but as long as you can hear us, that's fine. I think
Yeah,
we're
I'm okay.
all...
You don't need to hear all my washing machine and everything else. That's
Thank
why.
you.
But while you're unmuted, I don't think that our new members have had a chance to meet you yet, and vice versa. So should we do a quick round of introductions?
Okay. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
I'm Monica.
Monica.
How long have you been on the board, Monica?
Too long. Sorry. Nothing. I have no clue. I've
Longer
been
than me.
a member for a while. So now it's time to get back into the groove. So.
Good.
Good.
Monica's a single family homeowner, was actually one of the very first homeowners I got to work with at ACCT back in like 2007, 2008.
2007. Yep, we bought the house.
Yeah. Monica, you have such a great story about that. I don't know if you mind sharing.
No, my husband and I, Steve, we just had gotten married about 2 years before. We were both in our 40s. It was a first marriage for both of us, and we expected to grow old here. So we bought this house with ACCT's help. It was a 2-bedroom ranch. Well, and then a year and a half later, unfortunately, I lost my sister, who was a single parent of 4 children. So Steve and I brought in 4 kids, a dog, and an extra cat. What did we do? I think we got rid of the guinea pig. Anyway, and then we, with the help of ACCT, and we got Jeremiah Parker, we raised the roof on this house, and now it is a 4-bedroom with 2 baths. It's like a little cape. So, and all the kids have done really well. We have 1 left for high school.
Great.
Going off to Yale Law in 3 weeks. And one's in Japan, graduated from Middlebury, and another one's still at UVM. So that's the scoop. And if we survive the rest, we'll be doing okay. That's our retirement plan, by the way. There are. Oh.
Well, Yale lie. Hopefully, you should be doing okay.
Yeah. So
maybe David, Danielle, and Peggy, if you do a real quick introduction, just so Monica gets to meet you.
Sure. Just because you said my name first, I'm David Hamilton. I've been on the board for about 10 minutes, well, maybe 1 meeting. And I'm from Middlebury, lived here for about 15 years. I work in the fields of construction, real estate, and design. My background is as an architect.
And
that is all.
I think you gave my name second. I've lived in Middlebury since 1975 when I came to teach at Middlebury College. I'm now retired from Middlebury College, whatever it is. But I did teach Elise, and I've watched her career, and I was interested in the work she was doing, and so volunteered to be on the board.
thank you.
So my name is Danielle. I live in Virgins. I'm originally actually from Mount Desert Island, Maine. I moved here 4 years ago, almost 4 years ago. This actually in August. I live at McKnight, and before that lived at Creekview. I'm also work in fields that are, really intertwined with the housing. I work for court diversion, and I work, I teach the DUI class, and also I'm on the board of the Turning Point Center. So really invested in seeing how, what we can do to be helpful and supportive in the housing issue in this area is so daunting for some people. I'm in recovery myself, and you know, had to go through quite a process in order to even get a rental, but was able to do that through ACCT, and I'm really grateful for that chance to show that my life was nothing like it used to be.
Congrats.
Thank you.
So thanks all for doing those intros. Before we dive in, just maybe a quick overview. I wanted to check in. Originally, we had talked about an hour and a half would bring us to 5:30. Does that still make the most sense for people, or do you want to consider going longer?
I would like to plan on exiting the call at 5:30, and if it goes longer, I'm glad to come back and look at the recording.
Okay. Any other preference?
Me too. My little kiddo just got home from daycare, so I do have to get her dinner and stuff.
Okay, so that'll be our plan. We recognize there's a lot of material here, and we're certainly not going to get through all of it today. So the next question before we begin is, when you look at the overview, which is page 2 of the PowerPoint, is there a preference you have for which topics we dive into first? Briefly, there was the history and the Addison County Housing Needs Review, and there was a discussion of the strategic plan. Then there was a case study for McKnight Lane, then an overview of finances and reading the financial statements, then a discussion of board expectation and responsibilities. And we also wanted, per David's original suggestion, to leave plenty of unstructured time for just any questions out of the blue about any topics that seem relevant to you. So my question again is, of the prepared presentation, do you have a preference for what parts are most important to do today?
John, can I turn it around and say, what do you think a new board member really should know to be effective quickly?
My answer would be all of this. And if the question is in what order, I think the order makes pretty much sense. The only downside is it leaves the financial discussion fairly low on the list, and that is one of the more challenging pieces of working on the board. And yet, knowing the background and the history and talking about our priorities in the strategic plan are right up there at the top of the list as far as I'm concerned. Would you answer differently, Elise or Bob?
John, the finance is so absorbing and difficult that it almost wants to be done separately. I'm afraid of overload. So
Agreed.
If it was up to me, I would save that for last.
Okay. Elise, any thoughts other than going in the order you've prepared?
No, I think we can just dive in, and I think don't hold your questions till the end. I think just interrupt me as we go, and I think now I'm forgetting the order that I have, but one place that it may make sense to stop and do a deeper dive is on the strategic plan. I do think the development budget is really interesting, but we also plan to follow this up with a tour. So, we could get out at McKnight Lane on that tour and walk around outside, and I can tell you about the development at that point. So there are some options.
Okay, well, why don't we start at the beginning then, and I will keep an eye on the clock. And when we're about halfway through, I'll just check in and see whether people want to continue with the prepared presentation or go into open discussion at that point. And we can also take a short standing up and stretching break if people were so inclined. So having said that, Elise, all yours on the overview.
All right, it's going to take me 30 seconds to get the right tab up here, probably. Let's see. Show all windows. There we go. Board orientation 2020. Right. If I hit this guy, are you still looking at the presentation?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So I might breeze through history and alphabet soup and head into data, but as I'm breezing through those first parts, feel free to stop me if you want to pause on any of that I'll spend a little time on housing needs and then what we do in our org chart. The strategic plan is another one I mentioned where we might spend more time in there. And if we decide to, we could push the case study to the tour. You know, after the strategic plan might be when we pause and decide to go for finances or keep going if we're doing good on time. And then leave time for open discussion at the end. So this is a little bit of a timeline of our history. We were founded in '89, but didn't get our tax exempt status till 1990, which is why you might see different sources in terms of what year was our 30th anniversary versus our 25th. We started out purchasing mobile home parks and operating our single family program. That was kind of the origins of the land trust movement, where the nonprofit land trusts like us would own the land, and then homeowners would own the homes on top of the land. But the land would be held in trust and controlled by the community for affordable housing. And we also actually originally started with a conservation mission as well, the kind of dual housing and conservation focus that Vermont has. But sometime early in our history, all of the easements that we held were spun off to the Vermont Land Trust, and now in Addison County, that's more VLT and MALT performing that function. It wasn't until the mid-2000s that we started developing multifamily housing. Prior to that, it had really been developed by ACCT, now HOPE. But the sort of tension between HOPE being a housing advocate and a tenant advocate, and while also having to be a landlord, that's a very difficult line to walk. So we kind of shifted into that role of landlord and developer so that HOPE could focus on moving residents out of poverty and their mission. So we started developing in partnership with Housing Vermont in 2005. We moved to Vergennes just a little over 10 years ago. We had been in Middlebury. The housing management was being performed by HOPE when they owned the portfolio. Then it transitioned to Champlain Housing Trust. We didn't take on apartment management until 2009. And now that's one of the main things that we do, as you'll see when we get to our org chart. And then most recently in 2012, we added the SASH program to do resident support, housing-based resident support. It's hard to believe that's been going on for almost 10 years now. And then in 2019, just this little detail, HOPE retained ownership of the properties they had developed in the 90s and early 2000s. And then in 2019, that portfolio was formally transitioned to us. So now we not only manage all of the affordable multifamily properties, we also own them. And those are primarily low-income housing tax credit multifamily buildings. We're not the only LIHTC owner in Addison County, but we are the largest. Vermont State Housing Authority has down at the Commons, I want to say, and then a few properties in Vergennes. And Summit has a couple too, but we're definitely the largest LIHTC owner and manager and developer in the county. We're part of a statewide network. As I think you know, there's other housing organizations throughout the state. Some of them are NeighborWorks organizations. Sometimes that's a distinction that'll come up. We are not, we don't have a NeighborWorks affiliation, but Champlain Housing Trust, Downstreet, Wyndham and Windsor, I think they're the only three that do. There's also NeighborWorks of Western Vermont, but they only do the homeownership side of things.
Elise, perhaps you should explain what NeighborWorks is.
Yeah, so they're a national housing developer. They do a lot of the same stuff we do on a national level in terms of the LIHTC multifamily development, but they also do much more in homeownership. They have homeownership centers across the country. So Champlain Housing Trust also operates a homeownership center, as does Downstreet, Wyndham and Windsor. So for example, if you're hearing about some of this coronavirus relief funding, there is a program that was delegated to ACCD to help landlords rehab substandard units to bring them back into service as affordable rental housing for homeless people. And that program is being run through the home ownership centers. So in Addison County, that's actually most likely going to be NeighborWorks of Western Vermont. We're kind of split between Champlain Housing Trust and NeighborWorks of Western Vermont. And then we also have a little bit of a idiosyncratic relationship in that we have our own home ownership portfolio. We are managing home shared equity homes, and I'll get into what the shared equity model is later. But we don't run a full-fledged home ownership center. That's so like for housing counseling, we refer people either up to Champlain Housing Trust or down to NeighborWorks of Western Vermont. So we're part of this network. I like to share this because it's something that really struck me when I first started in 2015 as executive director, because we were in such dire financial straits at the time. And I was just really trying to make that case to whomever I could that if Addison County lost its nonprofit housing provider, we would be losing a major linchpin of our affordable housing system. So we play a really important role in the county. Some of our most important community partners that we'll talk about, the big one is Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. They are like the parent umbrella of this network. So they provide us with a capacity grant, and they're also a project funder. There's the Vermont Housing Finance Agency. They fund our new housing development projects. Vermont State Housing Authority, they manage rental assistance in many of our units. VCDP, the Vermont Community Development Program, and then of course Housing Vermont, who is our partner on almost all of those multifamily LIHTC developments.
Elise, are all of these nonprofits or any of them governmental agencies?
They are all, let's see, VCDP, well, even VCDP is under the banner of DHCD, but it may have, they're like, DHCD is like a quasi-governmental. I would say all of these are quasi-governmental except for Housing Vermont, that is not, it's a private nonprofit. And VCDP, I think that's more state government than the others. VSHA is kind of state government, but it doesn't fall under an administration. So, but VHCB and VHFA have their own charters. I'm a little less sure on the status of VSHA and VCDP. But all the people who work for VSHA and VCDP are state employees, and the people who work at the other organizations are not.
Okay.
Elise, if you're not going to get there eventually, have you ever pursued, or is there a reason you haven't pursued partnership with NeighborWorks or with, other national groups?
Yeah, so other national groups, I haven't really thought about it. There aren't, we participate with some national affiliations. There's a network for community land trust, but they're more like membership. It's
Right.
not really the same. For NeighborWorks specifically, this predates me a little bit, but I think there actually is a bit of a contentious history over which organizations in Vermont got NeighborWorks charters, and I think that there aren't any left, is kind of my understanding, that NeighborWorks doesn't want to have any more home ownership centers in Vermont. So there is a little bit of like a have-not in the network, where NeighborWorks organizations just have more resources because they have access to that national funding. NeighborWorks does its own fundraising as well, and they bring other sources to the table that we don't have access to. But VHCB actually does a really good job of making up that difference. Most of the NeighborWorks organizations we used to be what's called a CHODO, a Community Housing Development Organization, which is a HUD designation that makes us eligible for certain kinds of HUD funding. The NeighborWorks organizations pretty much all qualify as CHODOs. They changed Chodo, the definition a few years ago, and we actually lost our status. But some of the funding implications of that are basically that some of these partners have access to federal funds, we don't, and VHCB makes up the difference for us non-Chodos out-of-state dollars. So there would be some benefits to doing it, but my understanding right now is it's not an option and not a can of worms that I've sort of felt the urge to open. I think that the conversation that was more happening at least 5 years ago and certainly came up in our strategic planning process is, you know, did it make sense for us to continue to operate independently, or should we be exploring partnerships within the state, for example, with Champlain Housing Trust or with either NeighborWorks of Western Vermont or Housing Trust of Rutland County to our south. It's even more complicated for Rutland because they have both a nonprofit affordable housing developer, Housing Trust of Rutland County, and a homeownership center, NeighborWorks of Western Vermont. So that is a conversation that we might end up having. And, you know, maybe would it make sense for us to someday merge under the banner of Champlain Housing Trust and their NeighborWorks designation, for example. But we would be, well, that's a very long conversation. So
why don't we make a footnote as a follow-up to David's question?
Yeah.
At some future point to revisit the issue of NeighborWorks affiliation. Things could change with them, things could change with us. It may be worth re-examining down the road.
Yeah, it's a great question. Just jotting a note. Okay, more alphabet soup. MHP I use a lot, AMD, our apartment management division. The reason that's actually kind of interesting why it exists at all at ACCT is because, as I mentioned, we weren't doing the multifamily property management, the apartment management. We just like assumed that staff from CHT. So it was like we were two organizations for a while. We have two PO boxes, we have two letterheads, but we're slowly kind of like de-siloing that, I would say. But it's like an artifact that you'll sometimes notice about our organization and how we account for things, that we have this apartment management division as opposed to just like property management that includes the apartments and the mobile home parks. Yeah, I won't run through all of these because I feel like that probably won't be helpful. AMI, use that one a lot, area median income, basically the same as MFI, median family income. Any questions about any of these in particular? Okay, moving on. Housing needs data. Vacancy rate is one of the biggest things that we talk about. A healthy vacancy rate is usually considered to be about 5%, and that's the vacancy rate for rental apartments. It's actually sort of been approaching 5% recently for the county at large, but it's sort of different when you look at the towns, like in Virgins, for example. There's basically a 0% vacancy rate. Anecdotally, we hear from service providers that a lack of units is just a huge problem. Housing cost burden is another one. That's how much of people's income on average are they paying towards rent. 30% is generally the threshold for what's considered affordable. That's how HUD defines it. And almost half of renters in Addison County are paying more than that. I certainly know from my own experience when I was making about 50% of area median income when I first started out in Addison County after graduating from Middlebury, I was not paying 30% of my income towards rent, and I still felt stretched. So when you're very low income, 30% of your just because you have 70% of your income left over after rent doesn't mean you're still able to afford the basket of goods that you need. The point in time count is a measure of homelessness in Addison County. It's very imperfect, but it's kind of the best we can do, which is just literally counting everybody who is homeless on a given night in January, and this is done across the country. It's something that is ultimately coordinated by HUD. So in Addison County, that's been trending downwards recently. Was about when I used to give this presentation, was about 100 people on any given night. More recently, it was counted at 73, but you can see that well, it's supposed to be a census, but it's really not. It's, as you can imagine, very hard to count literally homeless people.
Elise?
Yep.
Are people in shelters deemed homeless?
Yes, but people who are couch surfing, for example, are not.
Okay, thank you.
So a lot of that, you know, it's hard to attribute that decline to, you know, particular success that we've been having necessarily. It could just be fluctuation. It could be that, you know, it was a warmer night in January, and or actually it's actually if it's a colder night in if it's a warmer night in January, then people don't have access to shelter the same way they do when it's really cold, and that when it's really cold, that actually makes it easier to count people, for example. So it's not a great count, but I think, you know, around 100 people or a little bit less on any given night in Addison County is what we're dealing with when we talk about our homeless population. It's largely individuals, by the way. In Addison County, the real problem with homelessness is, in terms of numbers, is single adults. There are definitely homeless families too, and that's obviously a big problem. But it's come up recently with the coronavirus relief funding, because a lot of it is targeted at families. And at the height of the epidemic in Addison County, for all of the homeless people who were living in motels, you know, we had about 100 people in motels at the height of the pandemic. It's down to about like 40 now, I think. Only, you know, fewer than half a dozen of those were families. The rest are all individuals. So there's this mismatch between the need and the funding that's available. The poverty rate in Addison County, that's actually been another indicator that's been trending down since the recession, but who knows what is going to happen in the wake of the pandemic. Our wait list, also not a perfect measure, because sometimes it has more to do with wait list maintenance than actual need. So maybe 100 households on the wait list who are waiting for housing. The average income is $22,000 about of those folks, and what would be affordable for them would be $550 a month. But later in the presentation, I think you saw in the annual report too, I reported the average contract rent in ACCT's portfolio is more like $850 a month. So unless somebody has that additional rental assistance, and I'll get more into this too when I talk more about the apartments, it's very hard to, you know, we may have a vacancy, but a lot of people on our wait list still can't afford it, even though it's quote unquote affordable. Just a link here for more data. And then I just kind of like broke it down into supply issues. We don't have enough supply. It's not getting built privately because the income from rent is not enough to provide a return to investors. I was just looking at the last privately built apartment complex in Middlebury, that big 40-unit building near the People's United Bank. And those one bedrooms are advertised at $1,650 a month. And that's what you need to charge to make a return on your investment. And, you know, we're talking about a lot of the need being at $550 a month. And then maintaining it. We can't charge less than that $850 contract rent on our apartments, because those apartment buildings have to pay their expenses. And those expenses can add up to about $700 per unit per month. And that includes very little debt. Most of that is O&M. Property taxes, we pay property taxes. Common myth that we don't pay property taxes. We do. So there's really a floor on how low we can afford to keep our rent. So that's, again, just that importance of subsidy. So, you know, shifting into the demand side issues, much of the need is just at the extremely low income level that we can't hit for those reasons. People also have other kinds of barriers. Typically they're related. So people can't afford the rent. Maybe they also have other barriers like poor rental histories, a history of eviction, maybe a criminal record. that prevents them from getting into housing. And that, that's related just to a lack of availability of services that could help someone be successful, or help ACCT to say, okay, even though you don't meet our tenant selection criteria, like Danielle was mentioning, she had that chance to appeal and demonstrate that her life wasn't like it was before. And a lot of folks just don't have the wherewithal to do that. And again, going back to just there just aren't subsidies available. The Section 8 subsidies, that wait list is closed for a housing choice voucher unless you have a certain kind of preference, like DCF involvement, certain kinds of specialized vouchers for people with disabilities, etc. Just a little more data on what it does cost to rent in Addison County. The official number for a median 2-bedroom is just over $1,000 a month, which requires $40,000 a year in income to be affordable. However, if you look on Craigslist and try and find an apartment in Addison County, you're going to be paying most likely more like $1,200 a month. Meanwhile, the median renter household in Addison County, for the most recent year data is available, they can afford $9.95 a month, and that's supposed to include your utilities too. A full-time minimum wage earner, you can see, can only afford that $550 a month basically. And then somebody whose only cash income is Social Security income, it's just not even close. They're going to need a housing voucher to be able to afford housing. This is some data on people who do rent from us. Almost half of our renters are at that extremely low, less than 30% of area median income level. So let's see, 50% is probably about $30,000 a year, thereabout. So extremely low is probably, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's probably in the low 20s-ish. Something in there. It's not full-time minimum wage earners going to qualify at that level. Just about, maybe be on the cusp. Then you add in people who are earning less than 50% of area median income, which basically makes them eligible for a Section 8 voucher, even though not that many of our residents have a Section 8 voucher. It's over 75%, and I think about 2/3 of our residents have vouchers. And only 4% of our residents are making 60% or more of area median income. Somebody does have a voucher, that's this ACCT median tenant paid rent. That's $411. So that's the level of affordability we're providing when there is rental assistance with the property. And this is just applying to our apartments. I'll get to our mobile home parks in a little while. So tenants with rental assistance is 170 out of about 250. And they're getting an average monthly subsidy of $534. A lot of our residents are retired. We are serving a lot of seniors, even though only 10% of our units are dedicated senior housing. And then the next biggest share of income sources is employment. I think we kind of face that myth and that stigma about affordable housing, that people don't work or they're all on reach up or whatever, and that is just absolutely not true. I didn't talk about everything on this slide. Any questions or? All right, so on to what we do. So the apartment management that I've been talking about a lot. After we bring Virgin's community housing online later this summer, we'll have 282 apartments under management. That's across 12 different low-income housing tax credit entities, some of which are single site, one building on a single site, others of which are scattered site buildings. So maybe some of the earlier developments that Hope did were to buy up a couple of of the larger like single family homes and convert them into fourplexes. So maybe they would buy 3 of them with tax credits and make that into like one entity. So we have some of those. So in total, it's 43 buildings. And the approximate total value of those assets, if you add up sort of their balance sheets, you get to about 35 million. Related to what I was saying earlier about the Hope portfolio coming over to us, and now we own everything we manage. We actually own a couple of things we don't manage. We, with Housing Vermont last year, we redeveloped Pleasant Hills Senior Housing in Bristol. So we're a co-general partner on that. We're involved in the asset management, but we don't do any of the day-to-day property management. And that's simply because property management is a lot of field work. So our property managers need to be out of the properties, obviously a lot. And that is our only multifamily property in Bristol. So later on, we talk about the finances. You'll see like how much of our finances are earned income, which means that the programs by and large have to pay for themselves. And so it just isn't cost effective for us to have to manage properties in Bristol. And then we have a couple where we actually helped a private for-profit developer sponsor an application. And that basically gave us either a right of first refusal or some stake in the property as a special limited partner. And we essentially did that because these are affordable tax credit properties that were in need of rehab. So we saw it as a boon to the county, even though it wasn't a nonprofit provider. They're still affordable. It's still benefiting the low-income folks who live there. So that's just sort of something to note. So then in addition to the apartment management, we also manage 9 mobile home parks with 340 lots. Lots to talk about there. We have this single family shared equity program that I mentioned, which was one of the first things we started doing when we came into existence 30 years ago. And that program is actually quite large. I don't know the exact numbers that other land trusts have around the state, but 78 is actually on the larger side of a single family portfolio. And that includes some Vermonts that are in our mobile home parks. There's actually a little bit of double counting there, about 10 units. Then we have our SASH program that starts up to 200 people. And then the 5th thing that we do is the housing development, basically rehab.
Elise,
yep.
Maybe a quick explanation of what SASH is.
It stands for Support and Services at Home, and it's a housing-based resident support program to help seniors age safely in place. And it serves a mix of our residents and also community participants, and I'll definitely get more into detail on that a little bit later on. So yeah, that's how I kind of break things down into our 5 lines of business. So apartments, management fees from the apartments are our largest source of revenue, and property management is kind of the largest thing that we do. Almost all of the apartments we manage are funded with low-income housing tax credits, which means that most of our units are restricted to households earning 60% or less of area median income. The way that the low-income housing tax credit and most of our funding sources for these projects work is that they restrict what we can charge in rent. So they don't provide this additional ongoing rental assistance that can really reach that deeper level of subsidy and provide whatever somebody needs so that the rent doesn't exceed 30% of their income. What it does is it basically says, okay, these units have to be affordable to a household earning 60% or less of area median income. Therefore, the maximum rent that you can charge is 30% of 60% of area median income. But whoever moves in there, regardless of how much they make, they're going to have to be able to pay that contract rent amount. And our average LIHTC contract rent in our portfolio is $845, including heat. I think I pulled that from the annual reports as a 2019 number. 101 of our apartments do have that additional project-based rental assistance from various sources, from HUD and from our rural development mostly. And that is a source that does every month pay the difference between 30% of that resident's rent and whatever that contract rent, approximately $8.45 is. So if we go back to thinking about that minimum wage earner for whom 30% of their income is about $5.50 a month, but the contract rent on their unit is $8.45, then the subsidy is going to be paying $2.95 on their behalf to make up that difference. And then just another thing to note about all of our apartments is that they are required to meet very high performance energy standards per our funders. It's a funding requirement. So we build very efficient, energy efficient buildings.
I just have a quick question. So the gap between the 30%, the 845 and the 550 or whatever it was, that's generally public money of some sort. That
Yes.
doesn't come from ACCT. That comes from some public source.
Correct. And it gets pretty confusing. Most of it is federal money, but depending on the source. So that the 101 units I've called out here that have project-based assistance, that means that that assistance is tied to that apartment. It doesn't go with the person. So if somebody moves into that apartment, they're eligible for that subsidy. If it's a rural development subsidy, ACCT manages that wait list and allocates that subsidy, though the money is ultimately coming from RD. Kathy's cringing because there's a lot of detail there that I'm not going to go into. However, if it's a Section 8 project-based voucher, that's actually administered by VSHA, the Vermont State Housing Authority, which is, the state HUD entity, which, my confusion about answering your question is that a government agency or not? Is it an artifact of the state or an artifact of HUD? I'm not entirely sure, but they administer that program and they actually have their own wait list. So like the resident, instead of just applying to us, they also have to apply to the Vermont State Housing Authority and qualify under that program. Mm-hmm. And then in the last slide, or a couple slides ago, I think I mentioned that actually 170 of our tenants have rental assistance. So the additional 69 have a housing choice voucher. So that's a Section 8 housing choice voucher that they applied to separately from us, that is also run through the Vermont State Housing Authority, but a different part of the Vermont State Housing Authority. Okay. Yeah, so it gets pretty complicated. Yeah. Any other questions about this? I was going to say something else about it, but now I can't remember. If I think of it, I will. All right, mobile home parks. I got to move my little Zoom window so I can read what I wrote. Okay. Okay, so these differ a little bit in their structure. Oh, I know what I was going to say about rental assistance. It's that technically residents who live in the mobile home parks are eligible for rental assistance. It's just very hard to access because it's only very recently that they've allowed it to be applied not only to somebody's lot rent, but also if they have a mortgage payment or other housing costs. And not a whole lot of residents have figured out how to utilize that, nor have we or our service provider partners that we would like refer a resident to help that, to help them access that program. But it basically, it used to be that it only applied to lot rent, and lot rent on average in ACCT's portfolio is only $325 a month, which is for the most part already going to be less than 30% of someone's income. So the mobile home parks residents, they're really rental assistance isn't really a factor for them. So whereas our apartments, because of how the low-income housing tax credit program works, they are actually legally structured as their own separate legal entities. They're actually for-profit legal entities, and ACCT has a wholly owned for-profit subsidiary called the Addison County Housing Group, so that we can enter into these tax credit partnerships as the general partner. So we have like a funny relationship with the apartments, and we'll you'll see kind of if you were at the board meeting where we talked about the audit, you know, what shows up on our balance sheet, it kind of depends on some of the nuance. With the mobile home parks, we just straight up own them. That's what it means, fully owned by ACCT. So those sit on our books, they sit on our balance sheet. We account for them separately. They all have their own individual budgets, their own individual funds in our accounting software. But ultimately it's all ACCT. We own the land, the residents own their homes. We're responsible for everything under the ground. Residents are responsible for anything above the ground. Median lot rent is $325 a month, as I mentioned, for this year. That's for 2020. That's compared to a statewide median of about $350. So we're below statewide median, and we're actually trying to bring ourselves up just for issues that will become clear probably. The major expenses that we have on the mobile home park side include all the infrastructure systems. We own the roads, we own the water systems, we own the septic systems, we own the trees, the drainage. We also pay property taxes and all of the parks. Unlike the apartments, most of which those properties were built with grant funds and carry very little permanent debt, the parks were not. The parks were much more highly leveraged, and we have a lot of debt on them, which is actually something we're trying to address right now. It's also sort of relevant, you know, in terms of their being wholly owned. It's a different risk exposure. We own that. We're on the hook for paying back all that debt, and anything, you know, a park expense that park can't cover, like somebody's, you know, we have to replace a bunch of septics. ACCT has to pay for that. So that can hit our budget very directly. Unlike the tax credit partnerships, where as the co-general partner, legally, we only own 0.0045% of those partnerships, and our exposure is pretty limited. So we've been, you know, infrastructure in the mobile home parks is a big thing that you probably saw from reading the strategic plan. It's all aging. These parks were all built in like the 60s on average. Some of them have had water systems replaced, but beyond that, there have not really been major infrastructure improvements. A lot of the infrastructure is very old, and even when it was improved, if ACCT bought the park, for example, say in the early 90s, I think we redid the distribution system in some of our Starksboro parks at that time, for example. The usable, you know, expected lifespan on a water system is 30 years. So, you know, we're already up on, we need to replace the stuff that's been replaced, let alone the septic systems, which are like, a lot of them are dry wells and cesspools that are original. So we are figuring out how to deal with that. And because the mobile home parks are typically more rural, you know, if they're in a town, they're a little bit outside of the downtown, like in Middlebury, Lindale's out on 116, Otter Creek's out on the Panton Road, Bristol's a little bit different. Those parks are right downtown, really great location. They pretty much all have on-site septic except for Otter Creek, which is connected to Virgin's sewer. And then a lot of them have their own water systems. And as soon as you have more than about 9 homes on a private water system, it actually becomes publicly regulated. So we operate 4 public water systems. 2 of them are public water systems, even though they're connected to town water, Lindale and Otter Creek. So yes, the source of the water is municipal, but we own the distribution system, and it's treated as what's called a consecutive public water system. And then Brookside and Hillside and Lazy Brook are all ground source systems. Hillside and Lazy Brook share a system. Meaning they're on the same well. So they're considered the same system, but the water, Hillside is about a couple miles away from Lazy Brook in Starksboro, up a mountain. And that water is pumped up there via a 1.5 mile long water main. So when that thing needs to be replaced, Hillside is probably the park with the biggest existential issues because of that water main. There's just no money there. Again, with this theme of the parks really struggling, the lot rents are kind of low. That the biggest park where that's an issue is Lazy Brook. Their lot rent's only 273, went up to 293. So we're almost at 300 in Lazy Brook. So they really have a revenue problem. More so, it's usually an expense problem. We have estimated, we've contracted with a couple of consultants to help us tackle a redevelopment plan for these parks. And they've, as part of that process, they basically estimated that we need to be cash flowing about $100,000 a year better than we are across all 9 parks to really be covering the true operating expenses of the parks, fixing the septics that break instead of just like jetting them or, you know, band-aiding it basically, or just not doing anything about it, you know, actually grading the roads when they need to be graded instead of just like letting the potholes fester until it becomes a habitability issue. Like, yeah.
Elise, when you say looking at redevelopment scenarios, are you just talking about funding the infrastructure renewal, or are you talking about permanentizing or parcelizing or a more substantial redevelopment of these parcels?
So we're not talking about like subdividing or co-oping yet. However, we are talking about refinancing. So right now, 5 of the parks are with the National Bank of Middlebury. 3 of the parks are with People's United, and 1 park has a VHFA mortgage. And right now, our preferred option is we think we can get 30-year financing at 3.7% from VHFA. The re-amortization is really what's doing the heavy lifting there to free up cash flow. But the idea is, so not only to refinance all of them, but out from 3 separate notes into 1 note and essentially treat them like one portfolio. We're going to take a portfolio approach to managing them, so they would have shared reserves, and some of the stronger parks would be a little bit more able to cross-subsidize some of the weaker parks, but even the stronger parks would stand to benefit from that shared reserve because, you know, the timing of when their expenses come due is going to be different. So that's the high level plan for.
So it's operational stabilization.
First.
Not exactly what I would think of as redevelopment, meaning that you're building houses on them more.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
But we are then looking at infrastructure improvements as well, but to the systems, not to the homes themselves. But you have actually landed on a big problem and a very tough nut to crack because you know, I've talked about the infrastructure because that's what ACCT is concerned about with it being below the ground. But, you know, from a financial standpoint, but from a mission standpoint, you know, the people are actually living in the houses which they own, and the quality of that housing is often not good. And so helping people upgrade their homes, perhaps, you know, what we've been doing with the zero energy modulars like the Vermods, which is something that is actually, it's not manufactured. It can be classified as real estate and hopefully appreciate in value. So give people something that's more durable, that's more energy efficient, and is maybe going to give them a bit more of a leg up when it comes to actually building wealth. But we can't just rip everything out and start over, as much as the town of Starksboro would like us to do that, because we don't own those homes, and you can't just buy people out or tell them they have to leave because their septic system doesn't work anymore. So it's a very challenging issue. And I guess the one thing I would add to that is it's not an issue that ACCT is unique in facing. This is affecting all parks across the state to one degree or another. And we are in addition to this consulting project, we're also working with some of the larger park owners, including the Housing Foundation, which is the arm of the Vermont State Housing Authority, actually, that owns all of they're quasi-state owned parks, managed by VSHA. They have 18 parks with 1,000 units all over the state. So they're bigger than we are. And then CDI, I don't know if you've heard of them, Cooperative Development Inc. They're a national nonprofit that helps resident-owned communities. Basically, they're a spinoff of Rock USA, resident-owned communities, another national group that helps mobile home park residents buy their mobile home parks when they go up for sale and form co-ops. And they have been finding out that when they do that, they're also underestimating the capital needs of the parks that need to be addressed. It's not just buying the park, it's also paying for all those capital improvements that need to be made at that time. So they're just as concerned about this as we are. So we've been talking to all of them. And our funders, the HCB, has been convening around this issue, getting some statewide attention on this. Prior to the pandemic hitting, there was actually some traction around doing another housing bond that this time would include mobile home parks. And then the coronavirus just took over everything. So it's going to need a statewide commitment. It's been very promising, though, I will say, to see the response that we've gotten from VHFA so far for the refinance. That sort of more alignment that they've had with VHCB than they have in the past necessarily. So I think they're going to have a more flexible underwriting process than they might otherwise, because they recognize that the mobile home parks are a statewide challenge that's going to require statewide investment. Yeah.
Elise, I don't want to hold you up because I know there's a lot to cover, but I wondered whether you collect data about residents that compares the residents of the mobile parks to the residents of other units.
Not yet. We are going to be gathering some of that data because some of the infrastructure funding that we want to apply for, how much subsidy you get depends on the income level of the people who live there. So we'll be doing some income studies. But because of the way mobile home parks were funded, when ACCT bought them, we did get some VHCB money, but that's state money that doesn't come with the federal reporting strings that the apartments do. So we're not required to income qualify people every year. We're supposed to income qualify them when they move in, actually, technically, but VHCB has never really enforced that, and it's never, it just isn't an issue. People who move into the parks pretty much de facto qualify or would qualify. It's an 80% restriction on the parks, actually, not a 60%. So, and it actually does, it only applies to a certain percentage of the people who live there. So we've never had an issue with like gentrifying mobile home parks or anything like that. So we don't collect that amount of data. We just don't have as good an idea. Anecdotally, from talking to people about how they've been impacted during coronavirus, I would say like fewer people receiving any kind of subsidy on the mobile home park side, maybe more SSDI, but most people work. A lot of essential workers too in the mobile home parks. So I think that's a really good mobile home park like rundown. Obviously we could just spend all the time talking about mobile home parks. Gonna move over to, apologies for this very text dense slide on shared equity.
Elise, perhaps before you begin that, let me just check in with people. It's 5 o'clock.
Yeah.
We have half an hour to go. This has been a riveting discussion so far. My question is, do you want to shift gears and have an open conversation, or do you want to continue with the prepared presentation at this point? Any preference?
This has been extremely helpful to me to see it go through sequentially. I would actually vote for continuing with the open, asking questions, and
Okay.
maybe even we do a financial separately. I don't know. We're not going to have time for finance, right?
Yeah,
Agreed.
I'm happy with the way it's going, and
Okay. Does anyone need a break, a stretch break, or should we just continue? We have half an hour to go.
Continue for me.
we can just get up as we need to.
Go for it, Elise.
Elise is
I'm
the
on
only
my-
one I'll need a
I'm on
break.
the yoga ball, so I can just bounce if I need to move. All right, so shared equities. This is also referred to as our single family program. And this is like nationally the community land trust movement. This was really core to the model when it was originally got going in the 60s in Georgia, actually, and had a very much a social justice and racial equity component to it. Now Champlain Housing Trust is actually the largest community land trust, I believe, in the world. I think they claim that. In any case, this model of affordable home ownership was really seminal to the land trust model. The original kind of logic model basically was that by owning the land trust could keep that land cost down, and then the home would be affordable because the resident would only have to pay for and only improvements. That's how it started. So all of the older single family homes in our portfolio, like I think Bob asked me this question at one time, like why is ACCT on the grand list out in Bridport? Because we actually own some land in Bridport that our residents own the home on top of. And then the mechanism for the resident, having the rights to that land basically was this ground lease. So the resident leases the land from ACCT for a nominal fee of $25 a month, basically. And originally that program was funded through the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. So that's how ACCT bought the land. We got a grant from VHB, we bought the land, the homeowner bought their house, and then started, paying us the lease fees. About maybe 20 years ago, the model kind of shifted. I believe kind of for financing and simplicity's sake. So now instead of owning the land, having the dual ownership model, homeowners like Monica own both the land and the home and the land that it's on, and the home is kept affordable via a housing subsidy covenant, a deed restriction essentially that runs with the land and restricts the future resale price of the house. So the 75 homes that we have in our portfolio now, we kind of do two things with homeownership. We do still get new grants from VHCB, so we can provide 20% of the purchase price of a home as a grant, and then that grant stays with the home, as does most of the appreciation. About 75% of the appreciation and the benefit of that gets passed on to the next buyer. So we can bring new homes into the program via those grants from VHCB, and then we also have resales. So I have some data and outcomes here on our resales. You compare the median home price in Addison County of about $240,000. The homes in ACCT's portfolio, they appraise for about $188,000. But then after the grant is applied, the actual price to the buyer in our portfolio is about $140,000. So it really makes home ownership a lot more affordable. It does very well on the affordability index, I would say. So that would be affordable.
Elise?
Yep.
Elise, I think I might have asked this before, but are those properties taxed at low income level rather than market value?
Yes, actually, there is a special formula that listers are supposed to use. And then on top of that, a lot of our homeowners, we can go up to 120% of area median income with this program now. You can qualify if you make up to 120% of AMI. They're usually going to qualify for, property tax equalization, whatever, HS 122, property tax relief, income-based property taxes. So if you're making $45,000 a year in Addison County, chances are you could actually afford to buy a home through ACCT. There are a lot of other opportunities, market rate opportunities that somebody at that income level could afford. It does limit appreciation. That's kind of the model. The period that I looked at from kind of 2008 to this is probably about 2018 data. fell over the recession, so that we were catching people who came into the program when prices were high and then selling when they were low. So I think I've definitely done some resales where the homeowner bought maybe around 2000, and it's a very different story. If people who bought 20 years ago are selling now, I would say it's much more typical to see that they're going to have $20, $30, $40,000 coming back to them when they sell the home. But from this particular pool of people who bought around 2008 on average and then sold between 2016 and 2018, they only walked away with about $1,375 in appreciation. They may have had more cash coming back to them because, of course, there's the forced savings of paying down mortgage. But definitely the program was sort of much stronger on the affordability side than on the wealth building side, if you're looking at both of those outcomes. Does anyone care to go through an example, or should I move on? Take silence for I should move on, and you have the presentation and you can look at like how
Elise,
yeah?
Elise, you've done the calculations before, I take it. Because Habitat, they've never done it. I dread the day when they have to calculate this. Don't they get credit for improvements like a garage or something like that as well?
Yep, it's a capital improvement, and actually it's kind of a capacity issue for us where we try to draw as much capacity from like the statewide network as we can, and we have a little bit of updating to do. We have to update our legal docs because according to our legal docs, there's one way that that's supposed to work, where we do an appraisal before and an appraisal after, and we don't actually do that. We simplify it. Basically, the homeowner needs to submit documentation to us that they made certain improvements. If you basically replace something that like is routine maintenance, that wouldn't count. But if you do something like Monica did, like add a whole second story and 2 bedrooms and a bathroom to her house, that's capital improvement. We would provide that information to the appraiser when Monica goes to sell her house. Monica doesn't mind me using this as an example.
No, I'd be happy to have information on this. I'm just
Great. So this is how it'll, theoretically, I know you were working with Mary on this, but like getting the documentation to your file, it's like record keeping was not ACCT's strong suit for a while there. But if we have documentation that the improvements were made, we give that. If Monica wants to sell her house, she basically signs, yes, I want to sell my house. I'm going to pay for half the appraisal. We get the house appraised. And we provide any documentation of capital improvements to the appraiser, and they actually value that for us. It doesn't really add to the cost of the appraisal. It's pretty nice, actually. And then Monica gets back 100% of the value of those improvements. So it might not be dollar for dollar what she spent, but it is dollar for dollar the value of the improvements. And then any appreciation on top of that, she gets a quarter of. And then that's how we come up with the purchase price to the next buyer. And then there's a small fee involved for ACCT. That's also earned income for us.
All right, you're set for a while because I'm not moving.
Great.
So, okay.
That's what I like to hear.
Yes, thank you.
I don't really have a staff person right now. So.
But just to tell you, the rest of the folks, I have to admit, when Steve and I went to buy my house, and not to tell you, excuse me, my husband's on disability. He has MS. And so when we went to the bank, we went to look at trying to figure out what it would take. We were renting in Weybridge, a small apartment, and we said to them, asked what it would take to buy, and they were like, oh, we ended up talking to National Bank of Middlebury, and next thing you know, we're buying a house with only $1,000 down. And we're just shocked because even our payments right now, including the taxes or whatever, are less than what we would ever be able to rent for. So in the area, I love the program and it's fabulous. And definitely, I don't, long-term, yeah, it'd be nice to leave my house to the kids, but I mean, to me, it's almost like paying rent. So it's amazing. And I wish more people could take advantage of this program.
I will say we've been struggling in the last few years. Demand has been really uneven. I've lost all track of time. We didn't do any new grants this past year. The year before we had more demand. You know, we only get 2 new ones a year, but we haven't had a trouble with resales. Those go quickly. But in terms of people being able to use new grants, the problem, what's been happening is the program basically works for homes that cost up to $250,000. You can't buy anything for less than $250,000 in Addison County unless it needs a lot of work, or maybe it's in Orwell, and we're trying not to, it's hard to have those more outlying homes in our portfolio. So, and there's already kind of some naturally occurring affordable housing in those areas. So we're trying to sort of shy away from those investments.
Yeah.
So it's really tough right now.
It is tough. Yeah. No.
Elise, do you, as a long-term, in your long-term accounting, do you count all the shared equity that's out there as, well, it doesn't actually accrue to, nothing accrues to ACCT. It's just going on to the next person, right?
Right.
It doesn't impact your balance sheet.
No, we account for it if we realize a developer fee on it, like on this slide that I'm on, down at the bottom, 6% resale fee to ACCT. That's when any kind of appreciation.
Yeah, sorry, dumb question.
No, it's fine. Okay, so that's shared equity. Then we just have SASH and development. The SASH program was a brainchild of Cathedral Square Corporation. They are a nonprofit developer of senior housing. They're kind of part of our network, but because they focus on senior housing, they're a little bit different. They're based in Chittenden County. And really the theory behind this model was that in order to help people age safely at home, you needed to be providing services at home where they were most of the time. So that is why housers like ACCT got involved in providing sort of resident services coordination, in this case for seniors, with that real focus on aging in place, and coming from Cathedral Square. It was originally funded through the state's Medicare waiver, and now it's through the all-payer waiver. So the money actually comes via OneCare. But Cathedral Square is still really the parent organization for the program. They provide so much support to us. They do quality assurance at our SASH sites. Our SASH coordinators have access to a online portal through Cathedral Square that has a ton of resources on it. So they're still very involved, but what ACCT is doing is we're employing a SASH coordinator and then contracting with our local VNA, so in our case, Addison County Home Health and Hospice, to provide wellness nursing on site as well. So we have what are known as panels. We have a full panel at Armory Lane in Virgins, and then 2 half panels, one in Bristol that's based at Pleasant Hills, and one out in Shoreham Orwell that actually does not have a housing site. Interesting story. Just quickly, the definition of a panel, all that means is it's a group of 100 participants because it's a capitated payment system. So we get the same amount of money for each participant, basically. So 100 participants in Virgins, 25 of whom are based at Armory Lane, and then the rest are community participants. So the ACCT benefits because we wouldn't have the scale that we needed if we only served our properties, and then community participants benefit as well because they get to access services provided by ACCT, but in their own homes that are not ACCT housing. So that's 100 in Virgins and 50 in Bristol and 50 in Shoreham. And I mentioned we own that housing site in Bristol, but we're not actually providing the property management. And then in Shoreham and Orwell, this program really started under Terry, my predecessor, who was very committed to resident services and serving seniors in particular. and had a vision of being able to build some housing out in Shoreham and Orwell, in conjunction with the Shorewell clinic that went in, 5 years ago now. And that just never came to pass because it ran into the challenges that ACCT has, building and owning housing in some of the more outlying towns. That being on the getting it built side, there is often lack of town water, town sewer, and lack of scale. Basically, we couldn't do 20. We really need 20 units to make a housing development feasible. There wasn't a market for 20 in Shoreham. We looked to Orwell to do 10 in Orwell, 10 in Shoreham. Orwell doesn't have town water. And so that idea never really went anywhere. And it's also very hard to manage, property management 20 miles away. Our housing is all income restricted. And when you start serving a lower income population, people tend to need transportation and they need access to services. And while the clinic is out there, there really isn't that connection to services that we usually look for when picking a housing site. The SASH, so down here at the bottom, I mentioned one of the outcomes of the SASH program is actually Medicare savings, which is how it got sort of funded as a Medicare pilot in the first place. It does save money for Medicare. However, there is a cost to ACCT, kind of an unfunded portion of the program. The reimbursement pays for the salary of it's one full-time SASH coordinator per panel and 10 hours of wellness nursing per panel. And that is just about all it pays for. It doesn't pay for any overhead, supplies, fringe, that kind of thing. So we've been running that program as a deficit now and really sort of fundraising to cover the gap, because we believe in its value to our residents. We actually downsized our Bristol panel from a full panel to a half panel a couple of years ago because of cost considerations, and we only have one 16-unit building up there, so it just kind of made sense. With Shoreham Orwell, you'd think that that would be one that we would maybe look at getting rid of, but it was really due to a couple factors. One being because it was only a half-time position to begin with, there's a lot less fringe and overhead associated with it. So that panel is kind of almost break even, at least on a direct cost basis. We don't have an office out there. The coordinator works out of a home. So financially, we've been kind of able to keep it going. And also the need out there is just incredible. That panel, the average age of the participants is probably late 80s. They're very isolated. That SASH coordinator has had a couple of instances where she has been the person to, find somebody who's fallen and hadn't been checked on in 24 hours or more even. So we just felt like we just could not pull the plug on that panel, basically. So we're still doing that out in Shoreham Orwell, though it is something that we kind of perennially think about. Maybe Housing Trust of Rutland County has a panel out of Fairhaven. Would it make more sense to kind of spin that off over there? But for now, it's kind of something that we're just continuing to do, as it's not a huge drain on resources, and it's high mission, I would say, at least, a little bit of mission creep, but certainly high value. Questions about SASH? Sorry, I kind of jumped around a little bit. Great, I'm going to move on. Okay, so development comes later. I'll just make one note about development, which is that it really applies to apartments. We don't have access to funding to develop. Nobody is developing new mobile home parks, although I know a few people would like to. It's a conversation, but it's not happening now. And with single family, it's kind of similar. We can be a partner kind of on the demand side for single family development, where we can maybe get like an extra grant allocation from VHCB, set aside some down payment assistance, but we don't have the money to build it, and we don't have the capacity or the risk appetite to build things on spec, unfortunately. So I think that's a big need in Addison County affordable homeownership, and one that we have limited tools to address. So through our partnership with Housing Vermont, they won't really do it either. Basically, everybody got burned in 2008 on Cottage Lane back there behind Hannaford and Middlebury. But they have done some, and Champlain Housing Trust has done some condo ownership. So you know, it's kind of like a maybe, but it's not something that is easy for us to do in terms of somebody looking for an affordable partner on single family development.
Can you tell us more about what happened at Cottage Lane?
Basically it was just what happened nationally with the housing crisis.
Okay.
The homes cost a lot to build, and then we had like $60,000 worth of subsidy to make them affordable. And then the market crashed and they were worth kind of less than the price after the subsidy anyway. They've recovered. Actually, they have recovered quite strongly. We had a Cottage Lane resale in 2019 that, that house appraised for $280,000, something like that. And that family bought it for $210,000, I want to say. So it's definitely recovered, but that's pretty much what happened. And there just isn't, like the grant programs that there are for multifamily, there just isn't as much to buy down the cost to subsidize the housing on the front end, basically.
Thank you.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So quick agenda check. Okay, so this is just, now that you know what we do, if you look at our org chart, you can kind of get a sense of the size of each program. Over here on the left, everything under Colby is basically property management, and everything to the left of Chris Ollette is multifamily. That's how much capacity managing those apartment buildings takes. We got one property manager for the mobile home parks. Right now, Michelle, our office manager, is handling logistical support for the single family program, and I'm handling everything else that is not sustainable. We have our SASH department with 2 FTEs, 3 staff people, 2 FTEs, and then our finance department that Kathy manages with 1.25 to 1.5 FTEs under her. And all of this is to manage, that's over 700 units when you count the apartments, the mobile home parks, and the single family homes, over 700 units of housing. All of the combined balance sheets, about $45 million. And total income, total like cash in and out of the organization on an annual basis of about $5 million. We do a lot with very little, I would say. Do you want me to spend more time going through the org chart, or 5:25? So,
How much caffeine you had?
not enough.
I don't know.
I guess our first decision is, let's decide how much more time we want to spend. Is it just 5 minutes? And if so, maybe our time is best spent picking a date for a tour, and we'll follow up on the strategic plan update, and I'll take you through a sample development when we do the tour.
I think that would make sense. I don't think we want to start on the strategic plan with just a few minutes left.
Let's
do
open Q&A, and I'll send out a doodle for the tour.
Questions, anyone?
I don't have any questions. I'm really impressed with how much you do and the presentation, so I want to thank Elise for this. But it's been pretty clear, but I'm a little overwhelmed by the variety of things that ACC does and the way it interacts with need for low-income housing. It's really, really quite extraordinary. So I'm glad to be here.
We're glad to have you.
I'll second that. This is David. It's been exceptionally, like, really helpful to see this run down. I mean, I can read through these documents, but it's actually been really helpful to go through it sequentially. I'd like to ask a specific question you may not be able to answer now, maybe when we return. But you know what? I know what the primary limiting factor is to getting involved in development, but can you describe a scenario where a developer wanted to do a substantial affordable component in a privately funded development that would work for ACCT to get involved? I mean, if that's of interest to the board.
So I would say it is of interest to ACCT, if not only because of the kind of state emphasis right now on leveraging private, public-private partnerships. Basically, there's been definitely a lot of talk at the state level on can nonprofit developers kind of come in with access to some resources like community development block grants that can pay for infrastructure. So, and I think you probably know some of this already, David, from conversations with BHCB and others. Could we assume some of the infrastructure costs and in starting a new development, and then have a private developer be able to benefit from that? Barriers to it getting off the ground, in a couple of examples that have come up recently. One, the developer was really looking for ownership, and for the reasons I mentioned earlier, that affordable ownership is not really a tool in our toolbox at the moment, unfortunately. And then in kind of a more a development that could involve affordable multifamily, the challenge we ran into with that site we were discussing on college land came down largely to location, and that is actually related to a capacity issue. I've mentioned that we partner almost exclusively with Housing Vermont to get this all done, and if I go back to our org chart, see if you can spot a developer on it. If not, there isn't one. It's really just me. So, hiring a developer is something that we consider. I would say, our capacity needs that we've been thinking about are hiring, not full-time, but on-staff fundraiser, on-staff developer. And actually, that's one of the things that I'm talking to the other big mobile home park owners about is they have so many infrastructure projects in the pipeline that also require a developer to pull together a lot of funding sources, a lot of finance, that we don't have that capacity on staff. So we're talking about a shared position, but it would really be focused on mobile home parks for starters. And then a couple other capacity needs that I have that, just like, gosh, a COO would be nice, but really a developer and a fundraiser are the capacity areas that kind of leads into. So yeah, it's hard, we want to be a resource for Addison County and meeting local needs in Addison County. And yet we're a little bit beholden to Housing Vermont's priorities and what they think that they can get funded. And that has largely come down to site selection. It's just been really hard to find a site that they want to jump on for that kind of thing.
So thank you. That totally answers the question. There are all kinds of issues in your way.
Thank you all for taking the time today. As Elise said, she'll send out a query to pick a time for our next session. Hopefully, Abby will be able to join us for that one. And we'll just take up the conversation at that point.
That sounds good. Should I do a quick vote? Should I also maybe send out a doodle for an hour follow-up finance only training?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Kathy, for joining us, and I am so sorry we didn't get to your portion of
All right. I've been quietly working here, so Okay.
And nice job.
Well,
Nice job.
thank you, everyone, and more to come. And please, like, if feel free to reach out anytime with questions or whatever.
Thanks for your time.
Thanks all.
All right.
Thank you.
Tomorrow, Elise.
Good job, Elise.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.